What's going on, guys? How are you doing? And welcome to a brand new tutorial from Udemy. Today we got a really comparisons hot video between the most popular React animation libraries. So we got Framer Motion, React Spring, and finally the standard CSS animation, or the regular CSS animation, of course being done all of it in React. Well, for the CSS animation, it's all available in React, in just vanilla JavaScript, whatever. But for React String and Framer Motion are specifically designed for React. They are pretty much React libraries that allows you to do like React animation on the go with an easy to use API, and of course with an advanced animation techniques. And of course, like both Framer Motion and React Spring, it uses the Spring animation or the Spring physics. They are both based on the Spring physics to get the most realistic animation out of it, which is, you know, super cool between both of these animations. Of course, as you see here, I've got like a bouncing ball just to preview actually and see the simulation of different animation libraries and how they work independently. And of course, they can clearly see it's quite different and it differs from one library to another. And not only that, it's not only on the performance pretty much, and of course the APIs is quite different. It differs from one library to another to see how easy the API is from one library to another. So first, of course, we got the Framer Motion API, and of course Framer Motion has came out not really long time, so it's super new, but it's like super powerful. It has a lot of things, a lot of examples if you really want to just master that out and, you know, get like a really advanced animation with it. You can take a look on the example section on framer.com API Motion. And second, there is the React Spring, which is super popular as well among the React developers and animator lovers. So it's actually available a lot in that, and it's quite easy to set up. Just like install React Spring on the go and you got it all. And of course you just like have some minor things like 1% not supported, which is IE11 or Opera Mini. Yeah, it uses, as I've said, it's actually springs instead of like transitions or linear functions. Well, like the regular CSS animation does, this one uses actually a realistic Spring animation just to make the animation look super realistic in different type of points. And of course, you can take a look on this like from the author of the React Spring, explaining why you should use Spring versus why you should use duration, or like, you know, the regular animation, CSS animation duration functions. So yeah, it's quite different, or it differs from one to another, and you can take a look on different type of things like the examples to see how it works. And lastly, there is actually the CSS animation, which we all love and we have been all working with. Like there's ease in and ease out, linear animation, and different stuff. So of course we're going to get from we're going to just see the comparison between the performance and how realistic they are, like from different animation as clear as in here. So that's why I made all of this. So try just to analyze between these three animation, and of course we're going to move on to the second step, which is explaining or seeing the different API levels, which, you know, the documentation, what documentation is actually explained more. If like more examples are provided, that would be like an added plus for each you know, library. And lastly, we're going to see the API, how easy it is to use the API for a beginner just to get started with, or for an advanced to pretty much create an advanced animation with the provided API of each library. So of course we start off actually with Framer Motion, and from the left hand side in here it's clear to see, which is the blue bouncing ball. The bouncing animation is quite decent. So you're seeing the ball goes up, it just like stops for a little, and it just goes down, it bounces back up and back and forth, and of course so you see the animation here. So it's quite realistic actually. Of course, Framer Motion, both Framer Motion and React Spring uses Spring physics, so they both based on that. And for both of these, as I've said before, what they look like is the Framer Motion, as I've said here, it just like quite realistic, as it's clear to see. It just stops a little bit, like when it goes up, then it goes all the way down. So just like it goes up, then on physics there is the P, which is the pull of the gravity. So it just like, gets pulled, then there's the bouncing as it goes up. So it's actually, if you know physics well, you're gonna understand how bouncing animation pretty much looks. So there's actually a pulley, like pulling off the ball towards the ground, then it bounces off the ground back up, which of course it creates like an exposed like force, which is gonna be of course it's just gonna let it bounce up back, then it just goes back and forth. Of course, in the real world bouncing animation, the ball is gonna stop bouncing, of course, but just like creating quite an imaginary animation in here for the frame of motion. So it's clear in here that's quite decent for the frame of motion. For the React Spring on the middle side in here, which is for me is actually the most realistic animation I've pretty much experienced between three of these and experienced in React animation libraries in general. So it's super like realistic, so it goes all the way up. It just like stops in a duration what is considerable for a real world bouncing ball. So it just like stops a little bit, then it just goes a little, just tiny by tiny, and just small piece. It moves like it goes ease in, which means it starts super slow and it just tries to go faster and faster till it reaches the fastest speed. It bounces back off the ground and it just goes all the way up. So it's quite realistic, as I said before in here, and it does that back and forth, since we're not doing a real world bouncing animation or ball bouncing animation, but this is pretty much React Spring is doing actually the most part of that. It's clear in here. It bounces back off the ground. And lastly, there's the CSS animation. So for those of you who wants to see how realistic the CSS animation is, for me it's not quite realistic at all in my opinion. And of course, as I did like quite analysis, of course it's not based on Spring animation, so it looks quite it's not real at all. So just like not bouncing, it stops up there. So yeah, it's quite not really that realistic, but it does the job pretty much for a bouncing ball. It bounces off the ground, it goes all the way up, but it doesn't stop really like when it goes all the way up. So it just has to stop for a couple of like milliseconds, then it just goes all the way back off. And for the bouncing, when it bounces off the ground, not really that well to bounce out of the ground. So yeah, the CSS animation in here is actually taking the last place for that comparison. So we got React Spring taking the lead in the realistic of the animation. We got frame of motion coming second, and we got the CSS animation, of course, which is the last one in that case. Now we're gonna be moving on into the next second step, which is checking out the API and the documentation to evaluate three of these animation libraries, and as well like CSS animation is not really like a quite a library. So for frame of motion, the API is super straightforward. The documentation in here is really well explained. You just like install, shows you how to install, how to import. There's actually different topics that you need to cover, and of course it shows you a snippet code, which is super important, like from the right hand side in here, and how you can use motion.dev and different like the API on React and how to use on ES6 and higher. And you can take a look on like quick start or topics. You can take a look on examples to see exactly how it works, and the examples are animated. They work really well, so as expected would be. So the documentation here is going to take a quite higher points because it's well explained. Like when I started working with it before this a couple of days of the tutorial, I didn't know frame of motion that well, so I just started working with it, and I found myself really quickly mastering the animation and knowing exactly what to do. So the documentation really helped me throughout this, and it's really like straightforward and right to the point. The text in here and it really explained. So it just like really categorized right. So the categories are doing really great job. And of course for the guides and APIs, so if you take a look on the motion API or even the animated share API, is pretty well explained in here. So I would love to pretty much give a point for the documentation or for the frame of motion documentation, because it really deserves it. And if you move on into the API, of Framer Motion. So here's actually the working code of the animation. So we got Framer animation, and yeah, so this is actually all the code that is powering this bouncing ball. We got a title here, and the most important part is actually the animation container. We got the ball, and we got the ground container. So it's actually the most animation part, and most likely it is the ball, which of course allows you to animate. It just gives you like an attribute or a prop to give it what values or transitions from. So just give it like a transitions, or it takes the Y attribute in here, and it just goes from 0 a.m. to 12.8 a.m. So just like you transition the Y position of the ball, and of course you give it a transition object. For the transition objects in here, we just give it like a duration, how much it takes to complete the full animation. We got the yo-yo, it is of course the repeats, or how many times you repeat the animation. We got infinity, which is of course a JavaScript global variable, which represents clearly in here in a number, and most likely we give it what animation it goes through in, which is ease in, because we want the ball to start really slow. It goes super fast at the end, it bounces back up, and it does the animation back and forth again. So this is exactly what is empowering the bounce animation of the ball. It's really simple and really straight to the point. For the API, all you need to do for Framer Motion is actually just you grab the motion variable, which has pretty much all the HTML attributes you can be using. So for example, you can do there is dev, and there's dialog, you can do span, I don't know, you can even use HTML, you can use whatever attribute you would like to animate. So you just give it in here, and what I'm doing exactly is actually using styles. So just give it like to style it, to give it some CSS styles, and we can just then use this ball component. I give it the attribute in here, and this attribute is actually what animation it goes through. So if you give an array, what simply it does, it just goes transition from one value to another. So if you give it like hundreds, thousands of values, or a couple of values more on that array, of course it just goes from 0 to 12 a.m. for example, to 20 a.m. and then so on and so forth. So just like it goes into a linear on transition between these values you give it on the array, of course. And most importantly is actually the transition function. So you give it the transition, you give it what attribute you actually transition in, and of course you can give it a properties right in here. And of course you can pretty much edit the Spring library or Spring attributes and configuration. So you can configure the Spring attribute like the friction, the mass, the speed, and different stuff like that. So yeah, you can give it a go in here and see how it works. So for the Framer animation, I've worked with it quite a lot, and when I started with it, the API was super fun to work with. I didn't find really like had any issues with it or learning the API. The API learning curve was super easy for beginners, so since then it was like a beginner, so it did know exactly how to work with it and how to get started with it. And I created this animation really quick. So the quickest library I've created the ball bouncing animation with was Framer Motion. So it's just gonna gain like a plus point, plus the API, or the easiest API I've worked with among these three animation libraries was actually the Framer Motion. Now we can go back all the way here, and we can see the React Spring. So we got the React Spring. I can go all the way back up in here, and we can see the documentation. So for the documentation, I can see you can start up with basics. So it simply it shows you how you use the hooks API, which is a super basic API. You can do like React Spring and stuff like that. So just really well explained as well. And here you see how you import stuff, how you put them together to get creates or like a couple of animation. It gives you the common API, which is of course the props API and the hooks API. So how you can use it. It gives you just like some interactive examples and how you can pretty much manipulate the different Spring configuration to get exactly what you need or what type of animation you want to just achieve throughout this. And most importantly, of course, it shows you different hooks what are available, and there's actually the example. So the example, of course, are super great. You can as well take a look on the examples on CodePen, so or Code Sandbox, pretty much. So you take a look exactly on the source code, how they work, and different stuff, which is super helpful for learning how this animation are actually being powered, and how, of course, the code empowering these animations. There's a couple of different animations that you can really learn from. So I loved this side of React Spring. So React Spring documentation is really great. It's pretty much the same thing as Framer Motion, but I find Framer Motion is more documented, but there's quite like more examples in React Spring. So it's actually, in my opinion, more examples in React Spring, but the documentation and the snippets code of Framer Motion is well more explained than React Spring's documentation. And well, for React Spring in here, for the API, so there's the Spring animation, and if we take a look on the Spring animation here, all we simply need to do, we get the animated variable, which pretty much does the same as Framer Motion. It exposes all the attributes in here, and you can just pretty much do a span, or pretty much whatever you want to work with it in that case. So you can do like a div or whatever HTML attributes or elements. And most importantly, here you got a container. So we're going to be talking about in a container in a second in here. So here's my animation container, here's my ground container, and the most important point in here is actually the container. Inside of it, it renders a child or a ball child, most importantly. So this container is actually a child or React element or React component pretty much, which gets returned from keyframes.spring. So we're just going to import keyframes, which is from React Spring, and we're going to get the keyframes, and we're going to just like do Spring keyframes. What this one takes, it takes actually a callback function, which is a promise-based callback, which is asynchronous. You give it, for example, a while true, so you can control this using JavaScript. There is no configuration or attribute to control this using, for example, linear animation or something like that, like Framer does. So for Framer, for example, clear here, we got a transition, and of course, we do like we say duration is going to take one, yo-yo, infinity, and so on and so forth. Here, we express the yo-yo is how much or how many times the animation goes through. It's actually using a while loop, and you can decide when the animation stops using the JavaScript API. Then you do a wait, so you wait for the next animation, and here you provide from where it goes to where it goes. So it's actually the the first state and the last state it goes in. So it just like takes from and to, it takes a couple of different configuration, like the tension, friction, velocity, mass, and what type of easing you're going to be using, and of course the duration. So this configuration is actually a Spring configuration. Most important, you can, in this case, you can discard the Spring configuration here. It's not really that important because it provides like a default values for them, and it does really great job. Most important is actually ease-in, so you can use ease-in, cubic in. And what I found like a down point is you have to install like D3Ease library, which provided by ease-ins, or you can provide your own cubic bazaar easing function, which is quite wild. I don't really want to do that, so you have to use this library in order to be able to use easings in Spring animation. And more likely, all you need to do is just to do another keyframe, or you can just go and do like next. You provide it with the same values like from and to, and here from and to, it takes pretty much whatever values you would love to use, or whatever values gets applied to a CSS style, because later on when you get to these values like the transform, it gets from like translate 12.8 AM to translate Y 0 AM. So those values are going to be provided throughout the render prop design pattern. Then you're going to be passed through to the ball styles. So this ball styles attribute is going to actually take this styles getting animated from this transform to this transform. So it's exactly what you need to do in here. So you can play with the API, you can provide whatever variable names in here, then you can use them effectively in here. Of course, you can use something like plotting, so just to plot the values exactly how you want them to be. But most importantly, this is actually the API, how it looks like. So you have to use like render props design pattern to get the ball running. Then it just gives you this styles attribute. You need to provide it to the couple of elements that you want to animate throughout this. Well, the API is quite advanced, because depending, or when you compare that to the Framer Motion is really simple API. All you need to do like transition, provide the transition attributes, and boom, you're ready to start. But in case of Spring animation, it's really like advanced. So you need to go like through async await. You provide what next functions, you just like provide render props, you have the styles. So for me, when I started working with this, I got frame motion like really quick, set it up for the bouncing animation. Then spring animation, I just like struggled a little bit to get the bouncing or the ball bouncing animation to exactly work. So yeah, that was actually quite a struggle for me. So the API wasn't really straight to the point, as well as the documentation. It didn't actually guide me throughout this really well. So yeah, the frame motion is actually winning against Spring Animation on the API and of course on the documentation. And most likely you're gonna find this code on GitHub, so you just find the link in the description below if you really want to just like grab this code repository. And most importantly, last but not least, there is the CSS Animation. And yeah, for the documentation for the CSS Animation, you can pretty much find it anywhere in W3 schools, in Mozilla developers, pretty much whatever, YouTube tutorials. It's everywhere. CSS Animation has been covered everywhere. So the documentation is quite huge. You can find a lot of tutorials, a lot of resources to learn from. So it's not really depending on anything like that. But in the most points or the most important part for that and how it works, so if you just go to like motion animation, all you need to do is just like set up a keyframes. Of course, we do like keyframes and just save it. I'm using styled components, so you can do the same here using a regular CSS file or SAS file or LESS file, whatever you use in preprocessor. And of course, you just go from like keyframes from 0, you transform and translate and just like specify a custom timing function depending on that transition, so to make it really look like a realistic. So it just like it bounces back off, so it goes ease in, then it eases out, then it eases back in, and so on and so forth. So how bouncing or ball bouncing exactly works. And obviously apply this animation with infinite or infinite duration in that. So you give it like specific duration and yo-yo in here, and yeah, boom, just like render the ball, the ground container, and the animation container, which contains both of these, and you are pretty much ready to go for the CSS animation. So the CSS animation is quite simple to set up. The API, we all know it. Yeah, it's still really well to work with that, but I still haven't actually got the CSS animation really quick to work well with this, with me at least. So I found that frame animation working a little bit better with the API at some point, but still CSS animation is actually quite winning on how much it took me to set up all of different stuff in here. But yeah, so that was it. So CSS animation is not really well like this, so it's clearly saying here if you want to do like real world animation, I would go for React Spring. Yeah, so this is pretty much my last word for you guys on the comparison between these 3 React animation libraries / CSS Animation. Is if you want just like simple API, really simple API and a good documentation, just if you're a beginner, know nothing, haven't worked with any animation library, and we just like quickly get started, I want to go with Framework Animation because it does the job perfectly with a good and decent, quite realistic animation. I would go with Framework Motion. The second part, if you just like do something, you don't want to use any library and just like you want to use your old school standard CSS Animation, of course you don't want to learn anything new, you can go with CSS Animation. And lastly, there is React Spring. So if you're not like really realistic and really configurable Spring physics with a really advanced API to work with that, and hooks API and different stuff. And as clearly see, the bouncing animation of the ball here is super realistic, like a real world bouncing ball. So I would simply go with React Spring. So depending on your scenario, you would go with that. But the most point, what I loved throughout these libraries is actually Framework Motion. I'm in love with that. So just like my opinion, I'm not saying to go with Framework Motion for you because it depends on your case scenario. But for me, I would love to go with Framework Motion because it works on my needs. So thank you guys for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed this comparison, a quick video tutorial. Try to make it really quick and try to give you just a point of different React animation libraries. So if you liked this type of video tutorials, like doing comparison between React libraries or different JavaScript libraries, I would love to do more for you guys. And yeah, we finally hit the 10k subscribers. So yeah, thank you guys for watching for that, and thank you really for that. Like I would love to that. I would do pretty much a video. Thank you guys, like a special video for you guys. And yeah, I'm doing like a new surprise for the 10k, just like super cool thing. You're gonna be seeing in a couple of videos chase. So thank you guys for watching. As I said before, for the millions time, yeah, see you guys in the next one. Adios.